Sunup. The town of Concordia, Missouri stretches and begins to stir. Farmers head into the fields, and a working mom heads into town. Along the way, Sandy Blankenship drops her 2 young children at the home of their babysitter, 28-year-old Tawny Gunter. Sandy's youngest, 2-year-old Billy, doesn't want his mother to leave.
I remember him looking at me that morning he was about ready to start crying, and Tawny was holding him so I could get out the door. And I wanted to turn around and go back, and I didn't.
At work, Sandy's day unfolds like any other until lunchtime, when she receives a call.
The secretary there was a good friend of mine, and she told me that there had been an accident, that Billy had fallen down some stairs, and they were taking him to Warrensburg Hospital.
At Children's Mercy, doctors give Billy a CAT scan and tell the Blankenships his skull is fractured. 24 hours later, he is pronounced brain dead. The Blankenships are urged to donate their son's organs and say goodbye. Sandy Blankenship looks to her babysitter to make sense of the tragedy. Tawny Gunter explains she had taken Billy into the basement and told the boy to stay there. Gunter walked upstairs to fix lunch. Billy apparently tried to follow, making it partway up the flight of stairs before falling back down and hitting his head in the process. 5 days after the fall, 2-year-old Billy Blankenship is laid to rest, his death believed to be a tragic accident. It will be 8 years before anyone has reason to believe otherwise. Amy Yonce is a working mom with a problem. She needs a babysitter for her 3-month-old daughter, Mariah Cisco. Amy, however, has a bad feeling about the only available choice, a sitter named Tawny Gunter. On the morning of August 3rd, Amy drops Mariah off at Gunter's daycare. A few hours later, she gets a phone call.
My secretary come and told me that, they brought the baby to the hospital. And so my sister took me to Warrensburg. And then, nobody really told us anything other than they couldn't get her to breathe on her own.
Doctors at Western Missouri Medical Center decide to airlift the infant to Children's Mercy in Kansas City. Mariah survives the life flight but dies that night. Kansas City's medical examiner conducts an autopsy but can determine no official cause of death. He declines to classify it as an accident, noting that the babysitter in this case had at least one other child die in her care. On August 13th, Billy Blankenship's aunt, Terry Holtamp, arrives for a scheduled visit with her local doctor. Holtamp, however, gets more than just a checkup.
He just nonchalantly made the comment, something along the lines of, well, that's really terrible that that baby died with that same babysitter as Billy. And I just about fell over. I was literally sick.
For 8 years, Holtamp has suspected her nephew's fall down the stairs was more than an accident, but held her peace. Now she wonders if it's not time to come forward. Under a new Missouri law, a fatality review panel is convened to inquire into the circumstances surrounding Mariah Cisco's unexplained death. Holtamp reaches out to Paige Bellamy, a panel member as well as prosecutor for Lafayette County.
I remember thinking that lightning was striking just too many times at one household.
1 month after Mariah Cisco's death, a team of investigators pays a visit to Tawny Gunter's home. Gus Colilis heads the team. His job, commit to tape a reenactment of Mariah Cisco's death.
What we're trying to do is to get a commitment from the person involved to lock them into their version of how the event occurred.
Tawny leads investigators through Mariah's last day alive. She puts the infant down to sleep on the bedroom floor and leaves the room. When she returns, Gunter sees something is wrong.
Her socks, and I just happened to look down on her feet, and they were real white.
Gunter's reenactment is consistent with the medical examiner's report and points to a possible SIDS-related death. With no other evidence to consider, investigators turn their attention to the second case involving Gunter. Billy Blankenship's fall down a flight of stairs 8 years earlier.
To me, it was shockingly clear that this was not the mechanism of injury.
Dr. Lori Frazier is an expert in the study of child abuse. Investigators ask her to review ER notes, as well as a CAT scan taken of Blankenship's skull 8 years prior. When Frazier reviews the x-rays, she finds a fracture that is massive.
You could see it in a kid who fell from a building 2 or 3 stories and landed with their head on concrete, something that has some force or velocity to it where the child's impacted forcefully.
With Frazier's findings in hand, investigators return to Tony Gunter's house a second time, this time to recreate the accident that claimed a 2-year-old's life. On December 17th, investigators roll tape and ask Tony Gunter to walk them through the death of Billy Blankenship. Gunter tells investigators she was making lunch in the kitchen, and Billy was in the cellar when Gunter heard 2 thumps.
I remember Billy, wake up, say, wake Billy. My telephone was on the wall here at the time. I picked it up. I had the emergency numbers up here. I called for the ambulance.
Investigators are suspicious of Gunter's story. As with the prior reenactment, however, they can find no obvious holes. Prosecutor Paige Bellamy decides to bring in a fresh set of eyes to review the case in the person of state investigator Jim Ripley. Ripley and Lieutenant Kyle Marquardt review the taped reenactment of Blankenship's death, paying particularly close attention to Tony Gunter's language, searching for any inconsistencies in her story.
I noticed that when she said that she heard the child fall down the steps, and then she said, I thought I'd just knocked the wind out of him.
Lieutenant Ripley calls Paige Bellamy with the inconsistent statement, one that, in the prosecutor's mind, crystallizes his case. 8 years ago, they buried Billy Blankenship, his death a tragic accident. Now cold case detectives exhume the 2-year-old's body, hoping to unearth a cold case of murder.
As soon as I saw the fracture, I thought this child didn't receive the injury from falling down the stairs. This was at least a 4-inch break in this child's skull.
The medical examiner's findings are unequivocal. Billy Blankenship did not die from an accidental fall.
He said, go back and tell the lady the facts don't fit the story.
2 weeks after the exhumation, cold case detectives Jim Ripley and Kyle Marquardt travel to Concordia, Missouri. Their goal, to get a confession from a babysitter they believe doubles as a killer.
Lack of better term, she was very stubborn.
She's very difficult. I mean, we interviewed her for a long time, and the truth is she got up to use the restroom, I think maybe to wipe her eyes or something, and Sergeant Marquardt says she's not going to tell us.
Tony Gunter returns from the bathroom and sits down. In a moment, and without warning, the babysitter changes her story entirely.
I went to the basement steps to tell the kids to pick up the toys that lunch was in the microwave getting heated. As I got around the corner of the steps, Billy was at the top of the steps. I think we both scared each other when I saw him and he saw me.
And she sat down and said, I saw him go down the stairs. I mean, that was a revelation, because up to that point, her story was she's at the microwave and she hears thump, thump.
When I seen him falling down the steps, I went down the steps after him. I didn't think he'd be hurt.
Gunter's story has gone from a fall she never saw to an accident she saw but did not cause. With police cameras turned off, she goes even further.
She's crying, and I just looked at her and I said, Tawny, you pushed him, didn't you? And she just nodded her head, yes, I did.
Cold case detectives believe Gunter is still stopping short of the truth. Gunter's statement, however, is enough to support a charge of murder in the second degree. 11 years to the day of Billy Blankenship's death, she pleads guilty to voluntary manslaughter. As for the other infant that died in her care, cold case detectives can develop no evidence proving that Gunter was responsible for Mariah Cisco's demise. To this day, her death remains a mystery.
With respect to count 1, the court sentences and commits the defendant to the custody of the Missouri Department of Corrections for a period of 15 years.
Gunter receives the maximum sentence, 15 years. The courtroom empties, and nothing is left, save the echoes of a cell door slamming and a life never fully lived.